It was quite an adventure to investigate all of this, and it started really quite casually because Gordon and I would see each other all the time, and I still, what's this one thing that that I've been hearing about for so many years? Can you tell me a little bit more about it? And then I think Gordon and I must have sat for, I don't know, 10 hours, 12 hours with the tape recorder on, transcribing all this stuff. And it helps, yeah. Dinners and, but then, seeing each one of you, I mean, I spent an entire day in San Diego at Roger's house. I spent probably 2 days with the Scavardas in Ann Arbor, and then I saw you in New York 10 days before 9/11, as I remember very well, down in your place, and then a week later, so. And then I also talked to many other people, and so it was quite an adventure. And I'm very gratified by your comments. Thank you. Gordon looks like he's about ready to say something. You look like you're about ready to say something. Oh. Okay.
Question? Yes, Mark.
Thank you both for a really interesting talk and just the detail. I mean, as someone who's been interested in this music for a couple decades, those insights in those photos, so many wonderful things I've never seen before. So I wanted to pick up on this issue of reputation, Nancy, that you brought up. And I mean, my experience with theater is as a performer, as the one who's sort of in Page's shadow, as the premier artist of 4 minutes and 33 seconds. And somehow, I think the after effect of that is not only that Tudor's in the shadow, but because it was 433 and the controversy, at least that's the contemporary reputation that I hear most from students and colleagues, what they remember about Tudor, that he was seen as passive, as sort of being with the automaton rather than the creative vision behind it. And it just seems to me in this period, from what we saw last night, and the fact that the Roses and Once were fine performers as well as composers, that this distinction between performer-composer is in the way. It's this sort of ideological view that there's a creative role reserved for the composer, and that the performer is somehow maybe influenced by performance practices, historical performance that are coming up at a similar time, that this division between performer and composer is artificial and getting in the way of an understanding of the creative nature. And I think the other thing that feeds into this is copyright. That we have to give somebody the ownership of this, and that we can't, that blending that creates complications that are not eliminated. So I just wondered if you wanted to speak about the ideological issues that may be getting in the way of this.
Well,
Let me just repeat it for the
Yeah.
I won't repeat it with any of its glory, actually. But part of the issue of the stakes of Tudor's relative invisibility seemed to have to do with the way in which his activity eclipsed the distinction between creator and performer in a way that seems to slide under the radar screen, and also issues of copyright. Do you want to come in right on the subject, Marjorie? You want to wait?
Well, that was a
Okay.
lot.
Okay.
Yeah.
Why don't you respond to that, and then we'll.
Yeah, no, very interesting. First of all, there is an irony in the fact that he's best known by a lot of people who maybe don't know the circle as well for 4 minutes 33, where he did not play, and he was a virtuoso. So, I mean, there's a certain irony in that right away. The people who really knew him, the composers who wrote exclusively for him, wrote works that really couldn't be played by anybody else, thought of him as a virtuoso and also this amazing problem solver. But as far as, the composer-performer distinction, I mean, this is something that scholars of Tudor, particularly John Holtz-Apfel, James Pritchett, really among the pioneers, Tudor never signed his realizations. I mean, there was the great paradox that John Holtz-Apfel discovered, that he notated fully all the graphic scores that were given to him, whether Feldman, Brown, Wolf, Cage. And yet he didn't sign those. I mean, he didn't consider those, he copyrighted or anything. He only began signing his schematics and his live electronic, diagrams. So, it's one of these very interesting things where the artist himself is somehow in part responsible for the problem, if you want to say it's a problem, and I think it is a problem. And I think it does have to do with the fact that he had this career as a performer, which then kind of elided into a compositional career with the variations, variations 2, Laura? Yeah, variations 2. Variations 2 and then Bandonian. But also because I was arguing, and I would continue to argue, collaborated and maybe didn't expect or want to surface beyond that. But we all now figure he has to. I mean, he has to be kind of looked at as an individual, and yet how does one do that? So.
Yeah, I
Follow
wanted to
up
follow.
on-
Yeah, I just want. Yeah, go ahead.
Tudor's attitude towards recording. I know Cage had a lot of anxiety and actually felt that recording wasn't really feasible. I mean, this would be the other way in which Tudor could be known, right? If there were to help he set some performances there from you, and yet I don't know. You have all these tapes,
Yeah.
but it doesn't seem that they were commercially released
No.
because they weren't valuable, or was it because they didn't think they were valuable?
Follow-up question is a further reason for this relative invisibility the lack of recordings, and if so, why the lack of recordings?
There's no recording industry. You can't have recordings unless you have recording industry.
In the 50s. Yeah.
Nobody was recorded.
Well, I think, Mark, you brought up a really important issue because there's collaboration and there's collaboration, and we can think of a lot of collaborative endeavors, and sometimes the individual comes out very much in the fore, as Cage, who, collaborated with so many different people, and yet he stands out as the primary. So it's a very, very complex issue, and maybe the way he viewed his own role in the collaborative process comes into the fore here, which is something that you pointed out. And I think we should ask Gordon Muma to comment on this because he worked with the Cunningham Festival and he watched Tudor in the collaborative process. And maybe Gordon has something to...
Wait, could I pass you the mic? Sorry about that. If I can get you the mic, if you're going to actually talk about this, let's get you a mic. Right there. Is it on?
I want to, the two, is this, not wheeling back? Okay. Yes, I worked with Tudor collaboratively, interactively from about 1960 on, even though I'd met him much earlier. But I want to make one point just before I jump into this aspect. You showed some wonderful material of the way he structured and worked on diagrams and devoted incredible attention, almost obsessive attention, to the structural arrangements of what he did, with the ways that he could interact and shift around, but within well-defined proportional situations. That, by the way, is a kind of an echo, I suppose you might say, of the way John Cage often did with his notation. But I must make a point here that's often missed. David Tudor's beginning was as a virtuoso organist. You must remember, even though everybody thinks he was the hot deal pianist, which he was, he began as an organist, which is a kind of performance aspect that involves both creative decisions and never having the same instrument twice, unless you happen to be sitting in the same church or the same building. Organ is a great, messy sort of thing. It's almost an underwater machine like with kites, if I can exaggerate a bit. Constantly shifting stops and all of that sort of stuff and making decisions on the spot as an organist, and he was a very substantial organist until he got grabbed into doing the piano works. You could have said nothing about what some of those scores were up there, the plotting out of the things, and I thought, is this for something he was doing later, or is that just his rearranging things he's going to do, improvising at the organ? I want to bring that in because it broadens that whole aspect of it. Have you connected with Jackie Matisse in detail about the kite work?
Absolutely.
It's very important.
I interviewed both Davies
Yeah,
and
it's
Matisse.
very important to get their perspectives.
Yes,
Because they were all
absolutely.
individuals that worked together, but they
Absolutely.
were different people, of course.
Absolutely, and you know, exactly what you're saying. What fascinated me as I looked at the collaborative process was that they created the structure, and he worked with it, but he liked working with timings. I mean, that's exactly what you're saying. But it was really a structure they turned over to him.
Yeah, yeah.
And Molly Davies told me that she expected that he would just do an electronic score on his own in New York. I mean, there was no need, except that it's cold in New York and it's nice to go to the Bahamas. There was no real need for him to be on the boat, and yet, you know.
Yeah. Another point that I want to come, this issue's come up a bit about what you keep saying, copyright and property and that sort of thing, the property consciousness. You've done a great deal of attention to how that has interfered or interacted or obstructed or encouraged or crushed the way of creative activity in any number of the arts, particularly the collaborative aspects. My experience with Tudor through all those years, and also Cage, was there was never anything in the way of property consciousness. We were essentially in a big field, all of us, the once people in a big field where there were things that could be put together, like a large playground. You pick up a rock here to bang on something that, who owned that rock? Who has the rights to the thing? Who made the first this or that? It's nonsense. Nobody thought that way. The interactive, creative aspects, particularly in the collaborative aspects, you just didn't spend your time worrying about calling your property lawyer. None of us had that stuff. That's imposed by the machinery around since then. It's very important to understand that. Who made the first pizzicato? We call a Bartok pizzicato, bang off the thing. Was that his? Who attached the first transducer to a vibrating acoustical object? Come on, that was all in the air. That was everywhere. You can't nail down those things arbitrarily and get anywhere in understanding these activities. That was one of the nice things about Tudor's work with the 1973 New Hampshire, I think you said New Mexico, it was New Hampshire.
No, New Hampshire.
New Hampshire project, which a good number of us collaborated, was that it was essentially an invitation to a big party, a potluck. Bring the things you have, let's see how we can put them together, rearrange the smorgasbord, if you will, of our materials in which to make a performance, a collective or collaborative performance. That was the fun part of it, is that it all had the sense of party going along with serious and skilled and dedicated individuals working together. And that echoes a lot of what the Once Festival was doing in the from the 1960s on. It was all what people did.
Gordon, do you have any?
Marjorie, are you on this topic?
I wanted, yes, I
Yes, please. Well, Marjorie, and then Roger afterwards,
I am.
please.
What I wanted to say is that it occurs to me, Nancy, that the relative invisibility, doesn't it have something to do with the fact that Cage did so much writing? Cage first, 1962, Silence. This is, for those of us who are in literature or in the arts and not directly in music, that's how Cage comes into the discourse. And it occurred to me when you were showing Bill Viola's essays have been published. I hate to be sort of immersed. Cunningham, there are numbers and numbers of interviews. In other words, I sometimes wonder if you just if you could find enough writings or letters and put Tudor's writings together, it would make all the difference in the world. And I don't know if the Getty has enough materials for that or not.
Well,
I mean, I'm not
actually-
saying you can turn him into an essayist, you know, the kind of writer that Cage was, but it is really striking that there are very few people. Think of now visual artists, Kossuth. Think of the various visual artists, the ones that are really well known. Think of Donald Judd. Think of, you know, all those people. They have significant writings.
Right. And Tudor, when he did write or speak, there are lots of interviews, and the interviews are fantastic. And his program notes, even if it was just a page, like the little bit I read, sculptures visually excited or sonically excited, were beautiful, but he didn't write much. But the other, so I think it would be incredible to call, we do have letters, they're very personal to Mary Caroline Richards, and we also have interviews that have been published and program notes. And I think that would be a move towards people understanding him better. Yeah.
Roger, please.
Yeah, I wanted to make, I mean, I'm sure all of us, that is all the Once people at least, are overwhelmed with the number of things that we would like to add to this fabric, plus and minus. In any case, Letta, I wondered one question to begin with. I have several. Have you looked at all into, or are you aware that anyone has looked into the possible interaction between Cacioppo's Cassiopeia and George Crumb's later fame over graphic notation? Because I certainly know that in 1961, George was still writing very straightforward, notation. It wasn't particularly complex in terms of timbre and so on, and it certainly had none of the characteristics that's obvious in George's Cassiopeia.
Interesting. No, I have moved on to other areas of research, so I haven't followed through on a straight line from what I did, but I'm not aware of anybody who has dealt with that. Now, Gordon, you were nodding your head. Are you aware of anybody who has drawn that connection? Fascinating, and
Well,
sounds pretty likely to me.
I bring it up for partially because there were a lot of other musicians working in Ann Arbor at the same time, including, for example, Crumb, Grant Boglary, and Bruce Wise, other people who were doing remarkable music, which was not a part of the once, let's say, commune or collective, but was remarkable and went on to be influential in its own way.
Yes,
One other thing I wanted to mention as praise to you, Lita, is the balance that you brought to the 100-page document that accompanied the New World set. One of the things that certainly was very disturbing to Karen and me, because we left Ann Arbor relatively early, that is in '63, was the degree to which once gets, let's say, dealt with from a particular perspective of an individual who has an obvious and justified passion over some particular person, some particular event, but didn't take the time to look at the entire structure and socially, historically, and so on. And I think you did that, and it's extremely valuable. One thing I'm wondering, and I would say this not only to you, Nancy, and everyone else who's here, if anyone has ever contemplated doing, in line with what was mentioned just a moment ago about the written record of David's, has anybody looked at the idea of putting together a really elegant presentation of all the visual material, the letters, the documents, the programs, the sketches, the communications, such as the one that you showed from the Dramatic Arts Society notes? It really would be an extremely wonderful thing.
That's right here at the University of Michigan.
And the final tag to that is, the same thing is true if we look at American history and you look at the difference between the status of Jefferson, Lincoln, Madison, and so on, in compared to Washington. It's the same thing. Washington left, apparently made only two formal speeches that he wrote out, one of which he did not give. So if you look at the relationship there, it's the same kind of thing. The record that is left is the thing which theorists and scholarship persons interested in those areas can use, and that in turn becomes the mechanism that creates the status that we're talking about in relation to David.
May I add something to this, which is, it's not just the amount of writing, it's the kind of writing.
Yes.
It's the kind of writing that creates a persona, in fact. That certainly is what Cage and Kossuth share. Their writing is actually creating a persona in print that is then capable of circulation and indeed celebrity, in fact. And so that I think those things are fundamental to the issue of visibility also.
I would like to say something. I am very grateful that you brought up that issue, because I am a scholar and art historian who started work on the visual aspects of the Once group. So I'm planning an exhibition for 2013 at the University of Michigan Dearborn. We already have a budget together, and this might be a good opportunity to get in touch with all of you, because as an art historian, I think there's a certain kind of contribution I can make from my particular angle. And in general, I work on the 1950s and 60s on visual art at the intersections between performing arts and film. So thank you for organizing this event, and I hope to get a chance to talk to you later on. Thank you.
So let me respond to all of that. First of all, I think we need to thank New World Records for allowing that length of an essay, because there's no way to have achieved the kind of balance and to talk about all of the different aspects of what was happening at the festivals, what stimulated the festivals, what their outcome was, unless New World Records was going to allow a booklet of that length. And I was, to tell you the truth, absolutely astonished when I first was speaking to them that they would even consider something that long. So I want to pay tribute to them. In terms of the visual, this is a really important aspect, and I'm really happy to hear about this work. Many of the scores, of course, have a very compelling visual aspect to them, as well as an oral aspect to it. And also there is a film, I believe, across the street, right? Do you want to talk about that? This film that Gordon put together of visual elements from the Once Festival that is being shown right across the street, right?
Just to confirm that everybody should attend to it. Across the street at the Institute for the Humanities, corner of Thayer and Washington, there are two events. In our gallery, there's the John Cage sound installation lecture on the weather, directed by Laura Kuhn, which everyone must hear because it actually closes at the end of Friday, so please don't wait. And then the other thing is there is a room in which there are archival materials from the Once Festival and a silent film on loop that Gordon Mumma put together of the Once Festival as well. And please go on over there at some point and watch that, for sure.
And all of those documents from the Dramatic Arts Center are right here at the University of Michigan, special collections, and the minutes of the meetings and so on.
Nancy, did you want to weigh in on any of this stuff?
The visual, well,
Yeah.
I don't know. I think it's pretty clear how I
Okay,
feel
fine.
about the relation to the visual.
Who's waiting to talk?
I just wanted to add one quick footnote. The director of the committee that conceived and generated New World Records was Ross Lee Finney.
Oh,
Who's waiting to
Good
talk? I see Michael Rich. You just holding it, or who would like? Who am I missing?
I think you passed your time.
No, it will take 15 minutes.
Oh, I see, okay.
In that case, absolutely, we'll take a 20-minute break. I want to thank our speakers very much for wonderful presentations. We will resume sharp at 11:30. We are now going to have a presentation on John Cage and then another presentation on the Once Festival and so forth. And our speakers are first Marjorie Perloff and then Rich Crawford. These are two people who I could probably spend the next 2 hours introducing, and it would warm my heart to do so. Marjorie is, I'm honored to say, one of my closest friends, and also I am one of her great admirers. She is not only one of the preeminent writers on modernist and contemporary poetry that there is, certainly, not just on the English language, but in terms of her knowledge of many languages, on French poetry and a lot of other things. But she's also had a uniquely symbiotic and productive relationship with poets. From Frank O'Hara on through the language poets, she has her criticism of them, her writing about them has been in many ways deeply stimulating for them. There has been a symbiotic relationship between criticism and poetry that is really what the humanities is supposed to be at its best, if I may say that, and rarely happens. It rarely happens. It happens occasionally between writers on music and composers and so forth, artists and gallery people, but only at its best. And it's been one of those marvelous things. Marjorie has written, among other things in her many books, a book on Wittgenstein and poetry, and that book, again, it derives from a sense of the captivation in which many poets have with the writings of this very deep and obscure and quite literary philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. But the book itself then becomes a document that poetry also draws on. And that's, if I may say so, about the highest praise you can give for somebody in the humanities, that they have an audience which includes the very people that they're writing about. And what they write is as important to those who they write about as vice versa. Marjorie's many books began with a book on Frank O'Hara, Yeats, Robert Lowell, and Frank O'Hara. Then she published The Poetics of Indeterminacy, Rimbaud to Cage, that was 1981. The Futurist Moment, Avant-Garde, Avant-Guerre, and the Language of Rupture, which is sort of classic today, and it's exactly a book that explores the multidisciplinary terrain, the multimedia terrain that has been sort of central to the entire set of events, the relationship between French poetry and French painting, Cubism, and literature, and so on and so forth. Her books also include, of which there are many, 13 at least, Differentials, Poetry, Poetics, and Pedagogy, The Sound of Poetry, The Poetry of Sound, co-edited with Frank Dworkin. Poetry by Other Means in the 21st Century will be published in 2010. Marjorie Perloff has been professor at Stanford. She's been professor at University of Southern California. Recently, she was a Weidenfeld professor at Oxford University, holds an honorary degree from Bard College, and it's just going to be marvelous to have her speak. After Marjorie, we'll have Rich Crawford, who I could spend the next hour introducing. Rich Crawford is, of course, known to all of you because he has been, for a long time, fundamental to the School of Music, Theater, and Dance at the University of Michigan. Rich Crawford is one of the preeminent musicologists about American music. He's currently working on a biography of George Gershwin. He's most famous for, as you probably know, America's Musical Life, A History, An Introduction to America's Musical Life, and the American Musical Landscape, The Business of Musicianship from William Billings to George Gershwin. And that really is one of the key texts of study on American music. He's had a deep and long relationship also with the Institute for the Humanities, if I may say so, including our event that we did 5 years ago called Opera in the Americas, American Opera, in which Michael Dougherty's Jackie O was featured, and other works. He has his wide-ranging and deep relationship with the broad domain of American music, from even folk music and musicology to popular music, is in a way part of what makes Michigan the place that I love to be at. The other side of it is, of course, Bill Bolcom, who has that same kind of capacious relationship with the range of American music. So from the musicological point of view, we have a similar thing, and also Michael does similar kinds of things. And so it's a kind of Michigan stamp in the best sense, so that we're thrilled that we're going to have a presentation on Cage by Marjorie Perloff, and then a presentation on the Once Festival by Rich Crawford. Then we'll have discussion, and we'll go on from there. Thank you very much. Go on, Mark.
Thank you, Danny. What he didn't say is that the Wittgenstein book I wrote, I could have never written without his help, because that is his great field of expertise. He taught me the things I know in various restaurants in Los Angeles. Those are very happy memories. I want to begin by saying that I thought we were going to be in Rackham, and I thought that you would all, that the installation, that it was mainly for the Humanities Center, and that the installation would be there, everybody would have just seen the installation somehow. So I hope you all have seen the installation of Lecture on the Weather that is there, because I'm going to refer back to that, but it's fine. And the video, though, I'm going to show you is of 1986, the Strathmore Arts Festival, and it was really quite an old tape, but now transformed into, I had it made into a DVD so that we can see some of the aspects. So this is on Lecture on the Weather, and I picked that because it is what the installation is, and been thinking about it a lot. Okay, I have two little epigraphs. The first is from Merce Cunningham. It was as with the leaves of a tree. You really look at a tree. No two leaves are the same, even though each leaf has the same general shape and structure. And then from Cage, Three Asides on the Dance, Cunningham and Christian Wolff bring about a dance which is not supported by the music. This is a realistic situation comparable to the fact that a tree is not supported by the breezes that blow through it. I want you to think about that. What does that mean? A tree is not supported by the breezes that blow through it. In 1975, as John Cage tells it in his preface to Lecture on the Weather, and that's available on the video accompanying the beautiful installation by Amanda Kruliak over at Rackham, Richard Coulter of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation offered the composer a commission to write a piece of music to celebrate the American bicentennial. I automatically accepted, says Cage, because the invitation came from outside the United States, the reference being to the last days of the Vietnam War, which hardly seemed like the occasion for a patriotic celebration. Coulter suggested that the piece might be based on text by Benjamin Franklin, but Poor Richard's Almanac did not strike Cage's fancy. He thought he might instead find an anthology of American aspirational thought that he might submit to chance operations, but none of the libraries or publishers he consulted knew of such a thing, and if we may have the first. Now, I might as well, instead of my saying it, have him say it in his words. This was at Strathmore in 1986.
Maybe the lights down, just, yeah.
Oh, no, I can't see anything but, okay. Am I in the way? No? Okay.
This work, which is called Lecture on Weather. It was commissioned by the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation.
Can you hear? Can you be a little louder?
Of the bicentennial of the United States of America. The first thing I thought of doing in relation to this work was to find an anthology of
That's what I just read.
aspirational thought and subject it to chance operations. I thought the resultant complex would help to change our present intellectual climate. I called up Dover and asked whether they published such an anthology. They didn't. I called a part of Columbia University concerned with American history and asked about aspirational thought. They knew nothing about it. I called the information desk of the New York Public Library at 42nd Street. The man who answered said, "You may think I'm not serious, but I am. If you're interested in aspiration, go to the Children's Library on 52nd Street." I did. I found that anthologies for children are written by adults. They are what adults think are good for children. The thickest one was edited by Commager, Documents of American History. It is a collection of legal judgments, presidential reports, congressional speeches. I began to realize that what is called balance between the branches of our government is not balanced at all. All of the branches of our government are occupied by lawyers. Of all professions, the law is the least concerned with aspiration.
Okay, thank you. And it is concerned with precedent, not with discovery. So that's Cage's little beginning of the introduction. How to subvert this state of affairs, how to subordinate precedent to discovery, all the while paying homage to the qualities of American ingenuity, pragmatism, and good sense, epitomized for Cage in the person of Henry David Thoreau, especially the Thoreau of the essay on civil disobedience. This is the problematic addressed in Lecture on the Weather, a mixed media work that deconstructs the media, a lecture whose words cannot be heard properly, you'll see in a minute, a choral composition whose voices are disembodied presences, a performance piece that anyone can perform, but in which no one is ever in the spotlight. To begin with, Lecture on the Weather is not a lecture at all, but an elaborate, rule-generated collage work. And Cage, and I'll read this for Cage, subjecting Thoreau's writings to the I Ching chance operations to obtain collage texts, I prepared parts for 12 speaker vocalists or instrumentalists, stating my preference that they be American men who had become Canadian citizens. Along with these parts go recordings by Marianne Amaker of Breeze, Rain, and finally Thunder, and in the last Thunder section, a film by Louis Frangella representing lightning by means of briefly projected negatives of Thoreau's drawings. Now, here, as so often in his production notes, Cage assumes a casual air that his actual work belies. For one thing, the agreed-upon time length for the spoken parts is rigidly fixed, quote, at least 22 minutes 45 seconds, 5 times 4:33, and not more than 36:24, 8 times 4:33. The numerical reference being, of course, to Cage's 430, silent piano piece 433. Again, the entrance of the taped sound events, breeze, rain, and thunder, is precisely timed. The breeze, quote, to be faded in at the beginning, the rain to be faded in after 11 or 12% of the total agreed upon performance time length has elapsed, and the thunder to enter abruptly after 63 to 70% has elapsed. Further directions indicate when the lights are to be lowered, when the lightning slides, you're going to see some are going to be projected, and inform the performers that the recording of thunder should stop abruptly before those of breeze and rain fade out, but that this stop should not interrupt a thunderclap. Now thus, although the Thoreau texts themselves were chosen by chance operations, their actual collocation together with sound and visual images is a strictly planned mathematical system. I stress that because there's more stuff written about Cage in the general press when the Oratorio was just put on, Cunningham and Cage's Oratorio in LA. You could, all the newspapers were writing things like, oh, it's all just stream of consciousness, you know, it just goes on, just talk, and as if things are done arbitrarily. There's nothing at all arbitrary. Since no single passage from Thoreau is repeated, and since each of the 12 text sets must have the same length, the performance of the simultaneous reading is anything but random. The chance operation in this context is more properly understood as a form of constraint, a rule-generated process, and that's true, I think, of most of Cage's pieces, a rule-generated process within which weather conditions can occur. Now, what is weather? In the dictionary, the OED, the condition of the atmosphere at a given place and time with respect to heat or cold, quantity of sunshine, presence or absence of rain, hail, thunder, fog, etc. Violence or gentleness of the winds. Also, the condition of the atmosphere regarded as subject to vicissitudes. Now that's the key to Cage's composition, in which a strict rule-bound process is subjected to the vicissitudes of the atmosphere at a given time and place. Specific features, whether the speaker vocalists stand or sit, or where they're located in relation to the audience, how or whether the audience is seated, whether the performance space is large or small, open or closed, inevitably differ from performance to performance. I first encountered Lecture on the Weather at CalArts, California Institute of the Arts in Valencia, in March 1984. That's where I first heard it, or let's say saw it. The venue, those of you who know CalArts, was that large empty, I think it's just called Room 1. It looks like a gym, pretty much. A large empty room with bare floorboards with a temporary platform at one end on which the 12 speaker vocalists were placed, a projection screen behind the platform covering the whole wall. At the Strathmore Hall Cage Fest, which you're going to see a little bit later, in May, because CalArts doesn't seem to think they have a recording, they must have it in their archive somewhere, of the performance that I saw. Anyway, at the Strathmore Hall Cage Fest in May 1989 in Rockville, Maryland, on the other hand, the performance space was a much smaller conference room with French doors on one side and a fireplace on the other. The speaker vocalist sat at a long table in front of the fireplace, facing the audience, which was quite conventionally seated in rows of chairs. Or again, at the Bard performance of 2007, the 12 vocalists are neither all male or Americans in Canada. They include John Ashbery, Merce Cunningham, Jasper Johns, Leon Botstein, and Joan Ritalik was in it, a woman, so they're not even all men. The film of this performance, which is available at Rackham, features close-ups of faces, especially of Cunningham's. It was a year before he died, I guess, to be seen while the recording of Cage's preface is read. So that's different again, and of course then there's the whole question of which is the film and which is the actual performance, so there are many variations. So no single version of Lecture on the Weather, whether live or videotaped, can thus claim to be the definitive version. The lecture functions as what I've called elsewhere in my book Differentials, a differential text. In this case, a score to be activated rather than a fixed composition. And by a differential text, I mean there's not one fixed text. There are versions. There are different versions. There may be 3 or 4, or maybe even more. So there's not the definitive text as there is of, we think of earlier things. But difference, however important it was to Cage, is never the same thing as anarchy or randomness, and I guess that's really my subject here, and I hope we can discuss it later. Difference in the sense of Duchamp, who was, after all, one of Cage's main mentors, sense of the infrathin. That is the smallest possible difference between two things. Duchamp said the difference between a shot being fired and when it's heard. That kind of difference. Or the difference, he would say comically, between the heat on the seat of your pants and when you get up, what the temperature goes down very slightly. And differences of that thought, very small, almost minute differences that we should be aware of. No matter what the conditions of a given performance, the lecture opens with the recitation of the 12 vocalists, simultaneously reading 12 different sets of excerpts from Thoreau, from Walden, the Essay on Disobedience, and the Journal, while weather sounds, recording of breeze, then rain, and about 2/3 of the way through thunder, the house gradually being darkened, begins to be heard emanating from the walls or ceiling. The audience thus finds itself not passively attending a lecture. Indeed, the simultaneity of recited speech reflects, as Cage has frequently remarked, our larger inability to listen to one another, but participating in an event. The performance, accordingly, is not about weather, it is weather. At first, when one hears gentle breeze, birds chirping, and then light rain, one reminds oneself that this is, after all, mere sound effect, rather like a film soundtrack, that the sound is not, in fact, real. But as the rain becomes more insistent, turning into heavy showers, and as lightning flashes and thunderclaps begin to drown out the reading of Thoreau's text, a strange thing begins to happen, at least it did at the Cal Arts performance. Maybe not anywhere else, but it certainly happened there. The audience, scattered around the room, some standing, some sitting on the floor, began to move closer and closer together. By the time the storm broke, lightning flashes appearing on the large screen in the form of briefly projected negatives of drawings by Thoreau, the audience was what looked like a football huddle. And it was the strangest thing, and it is true, it would happen right now. If you just feel it raining really hard and you think you're out in that rain, and we're kind of spread out here, you start wanting to be closer to somebody. It just doesn't feel very comfortable being that far apart. Everyone wants to join together and get out of the storm. Now, one cannot, of course, generalize from this particular event. At the Strathmore Hall performance, for example, it happened, the vicissitudes of atmospheric conditions, that the thunderstorm broke just as the performance was beginning. I mean, a real thunderstorm. And since the French doors of the lecture room were open to the outside, the real weather of May 5th, 1989, at 9 p.m., merged with the simulation outside, or did it? Now, we can play that next part. The videotape made of the event by an amateur crew, you'll see in a minute, spotlights the 12 readers sitting at their long table, the light fading and replicated halfway through by candlelight. The unanticipated lightning in the trees outside did not stop the projectionist from flashing, it's all right, the Thoreau images on the screen behind the reader. And that, I think, is the great irony. You'll see it as soon as we can get it going. You might think, Cage, after all, was there directing the whole thing. So you might think, since there was real thunder, then you wouldn't bother to have those visual images of the thunder based on Thoreau's journals. But no, it went off exactly according to plan with the real images. And so it's not the case that just because you have different weather and so on. Ready? Okay. We're just going to play a little bit here. No? Yeah. Now, you're not even going to hear the lightning and thunder because it wasn't a good enough recording. But you'll hear the reading. This is toward the end of the reading. Watch for the visual images now. In a minute. See? That's your lightning. Okay, I think that's enough. You get the point. So these images flash on that are supposed to represent the lightning. As for the sound of rain and intermittent thunder outside the doors, these are perceived on screen as little more than background noise, rather like the pounding of surf against the shore, the camera never leaving the faces or bodies of the 12 speakers. As for the members of the audience, they remained quietly in their seats throughout, so that the communion experienced at Cal Arts did not quite occur. Rather, the Strathmore audience marveled at the variability of weather, the coincidence of it really storming. That's what everybody talked about. Wasn't that amazing? There really was the storm, you know, and all that. When Cage was reproducing his simulated storm, it seemed like a happy coincidence. The performance parameters of lectures on the weather are thus extremely variable. Yet, and this is important, the multiplication of possible variants, whether chosen, seating or not seating, large space or small intimate room, day or night, or fortuitous, the actual weather, does not change the basic shape of the work. Sequence, preface followed by reading with precisely designated appearance of weather sounds and images, time length, spoken words, all these are fixed, and it is John Cage who's the author. Even as Samuel Beckett is the author of Waiting for Godot, a play, incidentally, that can also be adapted, most plays can, to a wide variety of circumstances, a bare stage, a particular locale like Sarajevo, where Susan Sontag's fabled version did it, the Japanese No Theater, indoors, outdoors, played for laughs, played darkly, and so on. From Cage's perspective at the time of commission, Lecture on the Weather has a particular, some would say too particular, didactic thrust spelled out toward the end of his preface. More than anything else, we need communion with everyone. Struggles for power have nothing to do with communion. Communion extends beyond borders. It is with one's enemies also. Thoreau said, the best communion men have is silence. Now, this is the insight Lecture on the Weather is designed to enact, whatever its specific performance conditions. Instead of lecturing us on politics, instead of defining community in terms of verbal images and metaphors, the piece gradually transforms, or is meant to, a skeptical audience, an audience that cannot hear the words read simultaneously, into a community. By the end, when the storm is subsiding and a gentle breeze is blowing, we're all in it together. Now here then is a text that was peculiarly for its times. Lecture on the Weather is a verbal visual musical composition that relies on recording technology for its execution. There is no complete written text since the printed page cannot reproduce the simultaneous visual and sound features of the lecture. The coordination of vocal elements, sound, and film image is achieved by elaborate computer calculations. Yet, so the lecture implies, the availability of such technology by no means implies that we're now slaves to automation. Cage was never a Luddite, and he never believed, technology is a terrible thing, any of the things that are very fashionable today, or commodification, or that we have come to the end game of art. On the contrary, Cage is suggesting that even as the early New England settlers achieved a sense of community out of mutual deprivation, hardship, and want, 200 years later, our own deprivation, the glut, for example, of would-be aspirational writing, as well as media discourse, can be overcome not by finding books in the library that will talk about community, but by finding ways to actually create it. In his study, The Electronic Word, Richard Lanham argues that even the most elementary prose, say that of a textbook or diary, is radical artifice rather than native transparency. And that is the paradox of Lecture on the Weather. Cage is too often misunderstood as the champion of the natural, the advocate of art as purposeless play, that is simply a way of waking up to the very life we're living, which is so excellent once one gets one's mind and one's desires out of the way and lets it act of its own accord. You all know these famous statements. And in the preface to Lecture on the Weather, Cage famously cites Thoreau as saying, music is continuous, only listening is intermittent. But intermittent, again, is not equivalent to passive, much less to random listening. Music may well be continuous, but for listening to matter, it must be selective. It must somehow formalize the amorphous material heard. Indeed, nothing is less transparent than a composition like Lecture on the Weather, in which the resources of such various media as film, magnetic tape, pictogram, musical instrument, and of various genres like lecture, poem, journal, and drama are integrated by an elaborate set of procedures. Lecture on the Weather is, after all, a fabricated, simulated natural event. It's a simulacrum, one that behaves like the real thing, causing the audience to come, so to speak, in out of the rain, even as it calls into question the ubiquitous modern lecture format in which A expatiates on a certain topic, just as I'm doing right now to you. Let's pause a minute and think about what a lecture is. A lecture, according to Webster's Dictionary, is an oral presentation intended to present information or teach people about a particular subject, for example, by a university or college teacher. Lectures are used to convey critical information, history, background, theories, and equations. A politician's speech, a minister's sermon, or even a businessman's sale presentation may be similar in form to a lecture. Usually the lecturer will stand at the front of the room and recite information relevant to the lecture's content. Now bear in mind that Cage had been writing lectures since Lecture on Nothing and Lecture on Something since the late 1950s. These early lectures are equivocal. Their 4-column format and distinctive mode deconstructs the normal lecture. Then again, Cage is still the one delivering them, and the audience is quietly listening. In Lecture on the Weather, this wall gradually breaks down, but of course that is the way even most of Cage's lectures work. He's up here, you're out there, and you're listening. Then too, whatever lectures we give or attend, none of us are likely to think of them usually as dangerous. On the contrary, the lecture, even when on controversial topics, is framed as a kind of safety zone, a retreat from difficulties and daily chores. Right now, here at the symposium, you're taking a little time off from your own work or personal activity so as to inform yourself of something new or at least something else. In response to this state of affair, Cage created a lecture, in Lecture on the Weather, that would assault us with increasingly unpleasant noises and images, and that would make us wish we were home in bed or at least somewhere more relaxing and pleasant. We might call Cage's mode defamiliarization, but defamiliarization of a sort the Russian formalists who disseminated the concept would be hard put to recognize, the object of a work like Lecture on the Weather being not to make the stone stony, as Shklovsky famously said, but to stage an event that can change our sense of the environment and how we respond to it, its ecology. Such simulation depends, of course, upon careful design. The question remains why, throughout his career, Cage insisted that his was an art of unimpededness and interpenetration, of Gelassenheit, the German word is the best word for it, Gelassenheit, letting be. Of Cunningham's choreography, for example, Cage remarked that the dance was no more supported by the accompanying music, I read you this before, than a tree is supported by the breeze that blows through it. The romantic metaphor is charmingly disingenuous. One thinks of Coleridge's Aeolian harp, played by whatever wind happens to be blowing, until one reminds oneself that a Cage score, say the oratorio, was anything but random, and that the dance movements could hardly help but relate to it in some form. But then the Romantics were themselves given to such claims. When in the preface to the Lyrical Ballads, Wordsworth insisted his poems were written in a selection of language really used by men, specifically rustics, because such men hourly communicate with the best objects from which the best part of language is originally derived. He knew perfectly well that no such transcript was in fact possible, or perhaps even desirable. You might say Andy Warhol ended up doing that kind of thing. You really just record, whatever anybody says. Kenneth Goldsmith, who we may talk about in the discussion, does that in a way too. But certainly Wordsworth just didn't. For one thing, it was written in iambic pentameter. That isn't how people usually talk, and so on. Nevertheless, his was a poetic revolution because it recognized the need to purge poetry of the poetic diction of the late 18th century, the inane and gaudy phraseology, as Wordsworth called it, whereby birds were always called the busy herd, never birds. Grass was coyly called green attire. The blue sky was the azure realm. The sun was Phoebus Apollo, etc. Or to take a look closer to home, consider Marcel Duchamp, who was also always given to pronouncements like, I don't believe in the creative function of the artist, he's a man like any other, and declared, for example, that the choice of ready-mades is always based on visual indifference and at the same time on the total absence of good or bad taste. We now know that, on the contrary, Duchamp chose and named his found objects with the greatest care, and that indeed his strictures were never directed against art as such, but only against what he called retinal art, by which he meant quite specifically 19th century French painting from Courbet and the Impressionists to Picasso. Artists usually are reacting against the establishment of their time or a previous period, not against all art or all music or anything like that. Just as the Wordsworthian revolution exploded the poetic diction of 18th century poetry, so Duchamp created a new conceptual art model as far removed as possible from what Malevich, another great avant-garde rebel, dismissed as painting chrysanthemums. If people knew what they were doing, they wouldn't paint chrysanthemums. That kind of battle cry. For Cage, and the Lecture on the Weather is just one small example, the principle was the creation of composition that would be consonant with the world we actually live in the latter 20th century. Melody, harmony, traditional orchestral composition or sonata form, these, Cage felt, had outlived their usefulness. The new age demanded a recognition of contemporary technology, traffic, and the practices of everyday life. Does that mean that authorial control, in this case over the sounds to be heard, has been renounced? Hardly. One does not make just any experiment, but does what must be done. One does something else in silence. And again, the famous permission granted, but not to do whatever you want, which I think is the crucial statement. At the end of the Strathmore Hall performance of Lecture on the Weather, the composer came up to the front of the room to take his bows. And I just want you to see just a minute of that. We have a minute, I think. The next one, because I just want to point out that it's framed, of course, as Cage's piece. It is not everybody's piece. It is not, in fact, although it does create this sense of community, the piece where whoever the readers are equally important or anything like that. And that shows very well when you see, how he concluded it. This was at Strathmore.
There was a recording of first of breeze, and then of rain, and finally of thunder. But I think through this system, the thunder was not clear, but that was part of the piece. However, the lightning you noticed, and the lightning came from the drawings of Thoreau. Which the idea was that if we could hear him, if we would listen, that we could bring about some kind of change.
That's all. Okay. And they thought about bring about some kind of change, and then everybody clapped. Those who had performed the written text, projected the Thoreau slides, or played the sounds remained anonymous. Indeed, the readers and technicians change from performance to performance and are in the end perfectly expendable and replaceable. But the composer remains in control, and I don't mean that at all in a negative sense. I think that's what art is. It is, as we know from the program notes, his piece. After the performance at Strathmore Hall, members of the audience lined up to get Cage's autograph, which has now become a familiar logo. If I'd done this in PowerPoint, but you all know that logo. It's like a logo now, that famous signature. And think about that. His signature is very important, just like any artist. It is not true that, it doesn't matter. Today, that signature, like his signature compositions, exists only as a copy, a simulation of the original. But its value is assured. It is the signature of an artist whose name is deceptively simple and whose work, like that of his fellow composers here in the Once Festival, we're only beginning to understand. Thank you. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Marjorie, for that. Now we'll have Rich Crawford and then discussion. Please, Rich.
Do you have any?
I could sit where Marjorie was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why don't you? Do you want to do that?
No, I don't have any.
Oh, you don't have slides?
No electronics. So I'll just sit. The title of this presentation is A Composer, a Scholar, a Professor, and a Student, Ann Arbor, circa 1960. And I begin with a letter. June 22nd, 2010. Dear Danny Hurwitz, thanks for your invitation to speak at Once Again. And please excuse my long delay in responding. I was a graduate student at Michigan when the first Once Festival took place. The spring of 1961 marked the third year in my pursuit of a degree in historical musicology. I'm pretty sure that Gordon Muma was working at the Hadcock Music House then, not far from the School of Music, which faced west on Maynard Street, up against Nichols Arcade. George Cacioppo may have worked at Hadcock's too. Roger Reynolds is a boyhood friend. We went to the same grade school and high school. We played some baseball together and had the same piano teacher in the neighborhood. The first Once Festival featured 4 concerts, but I didn't attend any of them. Nor do I recall the festival being mentioned in classes I was taking at the time, except for one, which was 16th Century Counterpoint with Leslie Bassett of the composition faculty. When I first got wind of the proposed Once Again Festival, it sounded like something I'd want to attend, though it does overlap with a concert I'll have to go to. Then, when you sent me your invitation, it took a while before I was able to imagine what I might add to such a gathering. As a Michigander who was there in a certain sense, I did feel an obligation to take part, especially because I've always admired Roger and considered him a friend, though our paths have rarely crossed in recent years. On the other hand, it seemed a waste of people's time for me to try to weigh in as a historian of American music on a local event that I'd skipped when it actually was taking place. Though I did attend parts of the second festival and reviewed one of its concerts for the Michigan Daily. Yesterday, before heading out to walk my dogs near Lake Huron, where we'll be staying until October, I read your message again. I'm still talking to Danny, and was struck by its lack of prescriptiveness. It occurred to me that if you and our colleagues see any merit in my trying to recapture something of my own thinking half a century ago, as thoughts about fatherhood, schoolwork, and possible dissertation topics swirled in my head, and whether or not once held a place in that kaleidoscope, then I'd be willing to give it a shot. In other words, I could serve as a witness to a phenomenon that I caught firsthand glimpses of through a refracted academic lens that I'll try to portray. Best regards, etc. But now a confession. While listening to last night's concert, a voice in my head sounded an alert. Holy smoke, or words to that effect. It warned, it warned. That talk you've prepared for tomorrow sure underestimates the gap between what you were thinking then and what the Once composers were actually doing. End of warning. Since I wrote this note to Danny back in June, I've followed through on his invitation to rely on memory in this talk rather than resorting to research. A good decision, I think, having heard Lita's magisterial chronicle. Anything I could have added to that would have been trivial. Having called Ann Arbor my home base since age 18, and being linked to the university's music school since I joined its student body in February '55, I do have a few recollections to share. The strongest of these that I can connect to once centers on members of the School of Music faculty. As a student, you gather information, you learn skills, you form attitudes. For me, beyond being in an academic environment centered on music making, the strongest shapers of attitude were 3 faculty members, 2 musicologists, and a composer: Hans T. David, H. Wiley Hitchcock, and Ross Lee Finney. Professors Finney and David were dominating figures. They were men whose sensibilities were musical in ways that reached beyond any social environment that I could imagine. As a master's student who had done a fair amount of arranging, could improvise, but never composed anything, I enrolled in a class called Composition 1, I think, in which Finney taught both music majors and non-majors. He met the class once a week. In these sessions, he talked about music, old and new, played and sang through scores on the piano, including some student work, discussed how to create musical events, and encouraged us to invent music in a dissonant idiom. We also had weekly lessons with private teachers, students of Finney who acted as graduate assistants. Mine was Henry Onderdonk. Finney, a cellist who also played guitar, was the kind of musician who could make music on the piano even while missing fistfuls of notes. For me, the go-to word in his technical vocabulary was gesture, which packed a physicality that made such terms as melody, phrase, and motif seemed a bit remote from the real action. In talking about harmony, Finney cited differences between stable passages and ones that were moving somewhere else. At the time, I was just realizing that a lot of what I loved about music had to do with a phenomenon I had no name for. Finney did, though. It was harmonic rhythm. My pre-Finney analyses, written in pocket scores, dutifully identified chord functions, subdominants, submediants, and so forth. My post-Finney analyses, though, concentrated far more on events, with straight lines drawn under stable sections, wavy lines under transient ones, and only unexpected or pivotal harmonies labeled. Finney embodied musicianship as a force of nature might, impersonally, fiercely, with lots of physical energy. In class, he and the music were the protagonists, while we students seemed anonymous bystanders. For us beginners, he emphasized that parts of a composition had to belong to a whole that took you somewhere or didn't. I regret to say that the heavily worked over fragment of unaccompanied viola piece music I had managed to compose in Composition 1 filled barely 2 minutes of the class's final concert. And the young woman who played it left no doubt that my artistry had failed to take her anywhere. If Finney talked about the whole and the parts, Hans T. David's teaching began at the other end of the spectrum, with details. As a master's student, I took 2 classes from him in 18th century counterpoint, and later PhD seminars in Renaissance and Baroque music. German-born, then about 60 years old, he had left Europe for the United States in 1936, working first as a librarian and then as an academic teacher, having won a high reputation as a Bach scholar. To us beginners in counterpoint, he explained that Bach was not the best model to start with, because Bach's works were layered with contrapuntal subtexts and mysteries. He proposed to teach us through more straightforward models, such as German treatises of the 1700s. He also shared with us his own inventions and fugues in a Baroque idiom. I believe that this strategy split the class into 2 factions: students who said they felt condescended to, and those who believed that our teachers' compositional labors in the vineyards of an earlier era reflected the hunger of this profoundly learned man to create music as well as to study it. Belonging to the second of these 2 factions, I found David's grounding in the deep past authentic, inspiring, and intimidating. The depth of that grounding I learned only later as a student in seminars, which David often began by inviting questions. You have to learn to ask questions, he told us repeatedly. In one such session, someone asked for his list of the greatest composers, and to my surprise, he answered with a list of 10 names, reeled off in chronological order. They spanned 7 centuries, from the 12th through the 18th. Here's how I remember it: Leoninus, Perotinus, Machaut, Josquin de Prez, Orlando di Lasso, Purcell, Bach, Handel, Haydn, and Mozart. What about Beethoven? Somebody asked. Possibly Beethoven was the answer. And then, what about Schoenberg? After a bit of nervous laughter from the class and a long pause, the response came. I have come to believe that Schoenberg was very sentimental and did everything he could to cover it up. As for David's seminar teaching, while music, of course, was the subject, the focus of his teaching was writing about music. Whether the seminar's subject was Renaissance music or Baroque music or something else, the emphasis lay on what amounted to musicological performance practice. Writers on music, David taught us, must show readers first that they are good musicians. Secondly, they must prove that they are good writers. And third, they have to show that they are not pedants, which is to say, purveyors of needless detail and acolytes of academic jargon. Reflecting on these priorities, musicianship, writing skill, and attitude, I see them as David's outline of what he found pedagogically possible with students of our ilk. Scholarly performance in musicology required language that fit both the facts of the music and its spirit. Good musicians who took up the scholar's trade would find their way to the facts, and a teacher could guide them toward finer grained evocations of the music spirit. Poor musicians would have trouble with both facts and spirit, but teaching could help them avoid embarrassing themselves on paper. Good writers came from the ranks of good readers, and exposure to good writing was essential. As exemplars, David touted two models, the King James Version of the Bible and the New Yorker magazine. I never heard him explain these choices, but as one influenced by the gospel according to David, I think his message was clear enough. Because music is a sounding art, from the majestic to the colloquial to the experimental, people who choose to write about it need language equal to the near infinite range of musical expression and musical sound. But at this point, again, I hear last night's warning voice. Better say more about all this emphasis on finding words about music. What if musicology students also had to compose something? Wouldn't the need to find music in their imaginations or on their instrument or in the ether enhance their ability to describe music, perhaps? Still, David was as serious about encouraging non-pedantic discourse as Finney was about mastering the skill of putting music down on paper and having it look professional. David's method of fighting pedantry was empirical. Rather than preaching sermons, he gave cautionary examples. One day he proposed that we consider the ugliest word in the English language. It turned out to be a word more often written than spoken, sectionalization, in which he pointed out suffixes had gone wild, including 2 iterations of shun. Another example came from a standard music dictionary, which made a habit of citing contradistinctions when contrasts would have done the job. An indifference to linguistic sound and rhythm, and a preference for arcane words over plainer ones, he warned us, reveal, and this is a quote, the distance between 2 ways of life. Such pronouncements were allowed to hang silently in the air, as his gaze moved from one student to another, begging the question from the old labor song, which side are you on? In emphasizing particulars, whether in class discussion or on written work, which he scoured with a fine-tooth comb, David took the role of stern critic. The comments he wrote on student papers delivered a running tally of your faults as a thinker, a writer, and, it seemed sometimes, as a human being. By almost any measure, his comments proved to be incisive and fair, and they always proposed clearer, simpler ways of putting things. But sometimes it took more than one reading to warm to their constructive side. I now see David's approach, condemning sectionalization, contradistinction, and language of that stripe as a way of targeting his third priority, a determination to raise students' resistance to the pedantry that tended to creep in as we tried to beef up our gravitas as writers. The third Michigan professor who left a big impression on me in these years came of age in the wake of World War II, H. Wiley Hitchcock, whom Lita has mentioned. Age 35, when I took American music, my first course from him in the fall of 1958. If both Ross Finney and Hans David were utterly idiosyncratic human beings, Hitchcock was socialized down to his fingertips. For me, and probably for others, he was a role model. Transparently a lover of music, accomplished at the keyboard, not shy about singing, intelligent in a polished, urbane way, always organized in the classroom, and a fluent, effective lecturer. A Michigander himself and a product, at least at the graduate level, of a University of Michigan education, he had earned his PhD with a 1954 dissertation on the oratorios of Marc-Antoine Charpentier, 1643 to 1704. The classes he taught included surveys of medieval music, Renaissance music, and other subjects on the periphery of music history, as the Academy then saw it, including 20th century music and American music. Hitchcock also helped to establish an undergraduate honors program in the School of Music, was active in the interdisciplinary American Studies program, wrote music criticism for the Ann Arbor News, and from time to time, he assembled student performers, musicologists, and other interested parties to spend informal evenings reading through little-known vocal and instrumental music from past and present. In the fall of 1961, Hitchcock took a year's leave absence to teach at Hunter College in New York City. In 1962, he left Michigan for a regular position at Hunter. In 1971, he moved to Brooklyn College, City University of New York, where he founded the Institute for Studies in American Music, a landmark institution for American research. From that time on, a string of further accomplishments made him the de facto leader of American musical scholarship. Author of a history of the subject that became a standard textbook, publisher of a monograph series at the Institute, editor of the New Grove Dictionary of American Music, and later of the Songs of Charles Ives and the opera Four Saints in Three Acts by Thompson and Stein. Organizer of scholarly conferences, writer of program notes for the American Composers Orchestra, and mentor to graduate students in musicology. At the same time, his street cred as a Baroque scholar, fed by summers and sabbaticals spent in Italy and France with his art historian wife, Janet Cox-Rearick, won princely recognition not long before his death in 2007 at age 84, when the French government named him a Chevalier of the Legion of Honor for half a century of work on the music of Charpentier. But here's the rub. Had Hitchcock been around to hear his achievements listed as they just were, I can imagine him saying, "Thanks, but you left out an essential part," which is that I'm the kind of musicologist who has always made a point of being a friend and colleague of composers. And he might have gone on to say, politely of course, what I liked most about the Festschrift that was published in my honor in 1990 was that, along with all those music history articles, it contained compositions by 11 composers of different generations and stylistic persuasions, including Virgil Thompson, William Schumann, Milton Babbitt, Ross Finney, Peter Dickinson, Robert Starr, Charles Dodge, Bruce Wise, Gordon Muma, plus a prose article by Roger Reynolds. Following where memory has led in this personal glimpse of the time in Ann Arbor when the Once Festival was born, I realized that the three people who did the most to shape my own musical outlook included a composer, a scholar, and a professor. Finney and David were outliers. Finney's energy and confidence embodied the force of self-regard that enabled composers to sustain themselves as created individuals. To take his course was to realize that. David's devotion to the glories of the European musical past seemed admirable, but it also warned this aspiring scholar that it would be absurd for me, a former sax player and Lester Young and Paul Desmond wannabe, who was now supplementing his income with a church choir job, to choose a musical path in which fluency in Latin, German, French, and Italian would barely get me in the door. You could learn life-changing things from Finney and David, but you couldn't emulate them. Hitchcock, on the other hand, was the kind of role model who showed that professor could mean pretty much what you wanted it to mean. Even before Hitchcock left Michigan, I learned two things about his intellectual leanings that left a mark on my own. One had to do with his skill at connecting things, composers, compositions, styles, social and musical customs that might at first have seemed unrelated, or barely so. As a writer and thinker, he cared a lot about context, and his bias was toward a music history that came out on the orderly side. The other thing I noticed was his predilection as a teacher and scholar to advocate for the new and the different, whatever the historical period, using his authority and taste to bring the unfamiliar, the lesser known, even the bizarre, into the academic fold. Hitchcock did not seem to be a haunted person, but I think it fair to say that he was driven by the question, how does this music, this work, this composer fit with all the rest of it? Keeping in mind that Hitchcock staked out unexplored French and Italian topics as a Baroque scholar, it seems no surprise that he was drawn to study American music, which involves vast regions of music making with no obvious link to the narratives of orthodox music history. As a musicological calling, American music was barely a blip on the radar screen when he left Michigan in 1961. Excuse me. By the way, in the spring of 1960, he took the trouble to nudge me toward the possibility of a dissertation on the deep American past, and once shown that fork in the road, I took it. Familiar before he left town with the composers who were seeking to create a new music scene in Ann Arbor, Hitchcock returned in the winter of 1962, as Lita has told us, to review the second Once Festival for the Musical Quarterly's Current Chronicle department. That experience left a mark on his broader view of American music. In 1969, when Prentice Hall published his 270-page History of Music in the United States, a whole page of the penultimate chapter was given over to two works by composers from the Once Group. Robert Ashley's Public Opinion Descends Upon the Demonstrators and Gordon Muma's Meanwhile, a Two-Piece, both composed in 1961. The last page of Hitchcock's book ends with this idea. The anti-classic, asymmetrical, expressionistic, self-defining architecture of sound in time and space in the work of modern innovators owes something to roots that lie deep in the American past. It's a graceful way to end a book. And it also shows a music historian, a good musician, a good writer, and clearly no pedant, constructing an interconnected history in which living composers are indispensable, bringing the music of today and tomorrow into history so that they are always a force to be reckoned with. Thank you.